Hello, we're about halfway through our series on Buddhism basics, and I thought I would take a moment to introduce this one from my office here at home and let you know about a few things that we're doing. You'll notice at the end of this talk, and also the one before it, and the ones that will come after it probably, that we've posted an email address, and you can send us some questions. Some of the questions that have come up during discussions here in DeLand, Florida, where I'm giving these talks, have been really good ones, and they've added a lot. So I hope that you will email us with questions that come up as you're watching this series, and I'll take a few at a time and answer them on video, and I'll post them here. And don't worry, we won't share your email address or anything like that. So far in this series, we've talked about the Four Noble Truths, and we've talked about the Eightfold Path. And we've broken it down into what we call sila, training the body and speech, and samadhi, training the mind. And so now we're moving on to Panna, which is the development of wisdom. This video is going to follow a little bit different format than the ones in the previous weeks. When we got to the question and answer period, there was one main question, and it was such a good one, it added so much to the talk that we decided to go ahead and just include it at the end of this video. But also I'm going to handle this discussion a little bit differently. The section on Panna consists of two factors from the Eightfold Path, right view and right resolve. And so I mainly focus the talk on right resolve because I'm going to go into various aspects of right view in the coming weeks. So I'm going to give you a little bit about right view now, though, and then we'll pick up with the talk that I gave at this week's meeting. So here's what the Buddha said about right view. And what is right view? Knowledge with regard to stress, knowledge with regard to the origination of stress, knowledge with regard to the cessation of stress, knowledge with regard to the way of practice leading to the cessation of stress. This is called right view. So in other words, right view largely has to do with understanding the Four Noble Truths, the way suffering arises and the role the mind plays in that. And the Buddha was pretty clear that we should avoid getting caught up in wrong views or in clinging to views that really didn't have a lot to do with the true goal of the spiritual path, which is to transcend suffering. So in other words, he doesn't want us to get bogged down with arguments about cosmic stuff and those kinds of things, which can be fun to talk about, but doesn't get us closer to understanding and stopping those processes that create suffering. But we can also include our approach to wisdom, a couple of other things. So in other discourses about Panna, you will encounter the inclusion of concepts like anicca, impermanence, and anatta, not self. But I'm not going to go into those right now because we're going to delve into that in some detail in the coming weeks. So for now, I want us to focus on how to practice and not get caught up in views about views. So thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I hope you'll send us some questions later on. Okay, so the Buddha says we want to focus on those views that have something to do with actually transcending our stress. And it's very common in his day for people to go around and talk about whether or not there's an afterlife, and to talk about gods and things like that, and argue about them at length. And it's still common for that to happen today. And he says, don't get caught up in that. It doesn't have anything to do with transcending your stress. It can be very interesting. I like these conversations myself. But when it comes time to training your mind to transcend the ways you create suffering for yourself and others, it doesn't really come into play very much. So he says, focus on, so that's why he says the well-instructed disciple discerns what ideas are fit for attention and what ideas are unfit for attention. And then you focus on those things that really deserve your attention. So, we can also, though, include in our approach to this idea of Panna, of wisdom, a couple of other things. And he says mainly we're looking at the Four Noble Truths, what causes stress. But there's a couple of other things that come into play that we bring into this, and I'm not going to go into detail with them today because we're going to spend a couple of weeks going into detail on these things specifically. But one of them is
principle of anicca. That's a Pali word that basically means impermanence, inconstancy. And the other is anatta, which basically means not self. One of the translations I've seen for that recently said, referred to it as corelessness. And I kind of like that idea, because there's this idea that there's something inside you that was where your being resides. And the Buddha says, no, that's not true. That what we see as being is a set of processes that are constantly changing. There's no core there that you could say, this is me. We're going to spend a whole talk on this particular subject. So I don't want to get caught up in those now, but be aware that this is kind of where we're going. But the main thing I want to focus on is the second part of Panna, which is right resolve. And here's what the Buddha said right resolve is. He says, being resolved on renunciation, on freedom from ill will, and on harmlessness. So in other words, we're going to set our minds on renunciation, and I'll talk about that at some length, on harmlessness, and on goodwill. So, any of you make resolutions and then not keep them for the new year? How many of you? Okay. I don't see any hands, but I see a lot of smiles, so I'm assuming those are the same. We do this all the time. You know, we resolve to do something differently, and then we stick with the way we've always done things, right? We work by habit. And part of this is just the mechanism of habit. The mind has a tendency to keep doing what it's done, and this serves us fairly well a lot of the time. If we had to think about each and everything that we did, we'd never get anything done. So the mind gets kind of wired to repeat what it's been doing. But then if you kind of take this to another level, in Buddhist terms, you'll see that negative karma tends to cling, it tends to perpetuate itself, create more negative karma. So if you want to break a habit, one of the things you can do is replace it with something else. So, for example, if you said, well, you don't want to lose weight, one of the things you can do, instead of just saying, well, I'm not going to eat, is you can develop a new habit, like going to one of the websites where you can log calories and logging what you eat, and then you kind of see why you're not losing weight or whatever. So you're creating a new habit. In karmic terms, you can do sort of the same thing. Rather than focusing on not having ill will, for example, focus on having goodwill. So you kind of dilute the effects of negative karma, negative actions, by doing positive actions, helpful actions. Yeah, you let go of the unskillful, but you do that in part by cultivating the skillful. So the Buddha kind of talks about this right resolve thing as being sort of a two-part process. And he's talking at one point about how he began to develop his own path, and he said, the thought occurred to me, why don't I divide my thinking into two sorts? Those thoughts that give rise to harm for myself and others, and those that lead to peace and happiness. And then he said, I saw that thinking imbued with sensuality, with ill will, and with harmfulness was one sort, and thinking imbued with renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness was another sort. So, and then he explained that he watched his thoughts very carefully, and he noticed that there were thoughts that led to his own disturbance or to the suffering of others, or both, and then he started to let go of those thoughts. So right resolve means basically you're going to set your mind on not doing some things. Being resolved on renunciation means that you're going to let go of some things that have been causing you trouble. And then being resolved on harmlessness, on freedom from ill will, means you're going to refrain from certain thoughts and actions. But then on the other side, the things you're going to do. So to get rid of ill will, you cultivate goodwill, which we do in meditation all the time. And then being resolved on renunciation means that we see how our clinging to short-term sensual gratification can lead to long-term harm. And we start letting go of those things in favor of activities that lead to longer-term happiness and peace of mind. So, most of us don't have too much trouble understanding the idea that we're going to cultivate goodwill. And most of us who've been around here very long, start to see the advantages of that fairly quickly. And most of us, if you become a formal Buddhist, you've taken the precepts and you're comfortable with that, and you're comfortable with the idea of not killing and stealing and all those kinds of things anyway, because those ethics are, kind of programmed into our society. But I use this word renunciation, and I look around the room and I see a certain amount of this sort of cringing going on, because and partly it's because you don't know what that means in this context. You think of renunciation as, oh no, do I have to shave my head and become a monk? And no, you don't. If you've ever made a resolution to stop smoking, or to lose weight, or to save more money, or even to do something like get more education, or travel more this year, or something like that, all those things involve renunciation in one form or another. So not eating as much, or not eating the unhealthy things that you like, or not spending money that you don't have on luxuries that you don't need, things like that. So a lot of the times people come to Buddhism to cope with day-to-day stress. And in order to manage stress, you have to stop doing some of the things that create stress. And some of those things, ironically, turn out to be pretty irresistible once you try to stop doing them, right? And so it helps if you can remind yourselves that renunciation is really a matter of giving up something that might be good, might be enjoyable, might even in some circumstances be healthy, but you're doing it in order to get something better. And I like the way Thanissaro Bhikkhu talks about this. He's the abbot of a Thai monastery in California. He calls it trading candy for gold. And I really like this idea. Like, how many of you like fudge? Okay, whatever. Pretend I said whatever you really do like. How many of you like it? Okay, good. All right, if you had a pound of fudge or whatever it is, and I offered you a pound of gold for it, would you take it? Of course you would, because you'd be happy to swap a pound of fudge for a pound of gold because you're getting something of greater value, right? So renunciation means giving up something that you might like a whole lot, but getting something that you're going to like even better. Yeah, if you're dealing with something like losing weight or not smoking or something like that, it's pretty easy to see what the gold is. If you thought about, well, I can keep smoking and die, or I can stop smoking and live, that's pretty easy to see what the trade-off is. But when you come to the kind of things that impede your spiritual progress, which are pretty much all things that the ego clings to, it's a little harder to see what the value of the gold is. We worry, I think, sometimes that we'll let go of the candy, but we're not going to really like the gold very much. So we cling to things that, even though they're not working for us, they're comfortable. We're used to the idea. We get a little bit of a trade-off, a little bit of a payoff out of them. And we know sometimes that we get a bigger payoff if we let go of it. Something like your egos need to be right all the time. Your perfectionism. Things like that. Your anger. I mean, a lot of people really want to cling to their anger. And you can see in other people, oh yes, I see anger is really bad. That guy shouldn't be so mad all the time. But my anger is justified. So we have to kind of do what the Buddha did and observe the thoughts and see where they go. This angry thought, does it create stress for me? Does it create stress for others? And look at it and go, what happens if I can let go of that angry thought? What happens if I let go of my need to always be perfect? You have to kind of look at it very carefully and see, how does that create stress? And when we get into the concept of anatta, a not self, and stuff like that, we'll see a lot more about how that sort of works. The other problem that we have, I think, with the idea of renunciation in our society is we tend to think sort of black and white. We either give in to our urges, so in other words, we're permissive, or we go to the other extreme and we repress everything. But remember, Buddhism is a middle path. It's not a compromise. It's a third way of looking at things. It's not permissiveness. It's not repressiveness. There's no, you can't do this or that. You simply realize what's harmful and to what degree, and then you relinquish the harmfulness of it. So it's like potato chips, right? A potato chip's not going to kill you. A habit of eating potato chips, 3 meals a day would be a problem. So you look and go, okay, well, to what extent is this pleasure creating stress? And let me work with it so that it doesn't create physical stress, okay, in that case. And it's the same thing with our habits of mind. We want to not attach, but that doesn't mean we want to be detached. So I'll use a really good example of what I mean by this. There was a king named Panna, and he comes up a lot if you reading the sutras, and he became a really big supporter of the Buddha, apparently, after the Buddha put him on a weight loss program. Apparently, Panna was a big guy, really big eater, and when they first met, he had came up to the monastery to see the Buddha, and he had just eaten an entire bucket of food. And so he's referred to as being gorged and panting. So you can imagine just the act of getting into a monastery left him breathless and, and uncomfortable. And so the Buddha saw this. And so when Panna asked him to give him the teaching, here's what he said. So when a person is constantly mindful and knows when enough food has been taken, all their afflictions become more slender. They age more gradually, protecting their life. When a person is constantly mindful and knows when enough has been taken, all their afflictions become more slender. They age more gradually, protecting their life. Well, the king was very impressed with this. It really connected with him, and so much that he actually talked a monk into going back to the palace with him and living there and reciting those verses every time anybody brought him any food. And sure enough, after some time, he became quite svelte. This king did. And so he went back and thanked the Buddha, and he said, indeed, the Buddha has shown me compassion in 2 different ways, for my welfare right here and now, and also far into the future. By this, he meant that the Buddha's instructions to be mindful and to know when he had had enough hadn't just made him more comfortable in the present, but it probably extended his life and had spiritual effects as well. The practice of mindfulness in that would spill over. Knowing when you've had enough, that's got benefits beyond just physical health. So, the Buddha didn't tell him, okay, here's what you got to do. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, you just eat cabbage soup. He didn't put him on a starvation diet. He said, no, when you've had enough. And so that's really what we mean with renunciation. We renounce too much. We know when we've had enough, and we stop there. Renunciation doesn't mean starvation. It doesn't mean that you can't enjoy anything. Pleasure is not a problem. But the problem is our attachment to it. We just have to realize that we don't need the kind of pleasure that comes about at the cost of our spiritual lives, that comes from our attachment to things that are really ultimately stressful. So that's a good question. So how do you cultivate wisdom? And that's really what the path of practice is all about. It's about cultivation. We'll talk a little bit more later about what goes into wisdom itself and right views. Basically, you get, you'll hear some ideas. You'll hear the teaching. And then you make sure you understand it, kind of analyze it. A lot of times, especially Zen people will talk about this idea of thinking and analyzing as if it's something you shouldn't do, but you really kind of do need to make sure that you understand what's being said, and then you put it into practice. And when you put it into practice, then you realize the fruit of it. And that's when it becomes your wisdom. Right now it's the Buddha's wisdom. It's a teaching that's 2,600 years old or 2,500 years old, somewhere in there, and somebody else said it. So just make sure you understand it. Make sure you understand what it means to you. So when we talk about something like anicca, impermanence, you'll hear it, you'll get it on an intellectual level, but make sure you get it on a level that you understand how this idea of constancy and inconstancy, or how the idea of self versus not self, how I use those things to create problems for myself or others. And then work on how to put these ideas, what you learned into practice. And when you do that, when you see, for example, how you use the idea of a self to make yourself feel bad, then you can look at how to make the idea of there not being a self help you let go of those stresses. And then practice it and see what happens. Do you feel less stress? Okay, then it's working. And so then this wisdom becomes part of your life and not just something that's in a book up on your nightstand or something.